With that, I would like to request the chair to please take over.
Hello. Shall we get started, Sumnima?
Yes, please go ahead.
All right. Welcome everybody to this panel on climate change and emerging dynamics in Nepal's foreign policy. Today, we have three panelists with us. Shilshila Acharya, who is the co-founder and director of Avni Center for Sustainability. Dr. Chandralal Pandey, who is the program coordinator of the Community Development Program at Kathmandu University. And Ravi Kumar, who is a doctoral student at the doctoral scholar at the Central University of Jharkhand. And he has an expertise on climate change as a threat to the internal security of Nepal. So to give you a very brief touch point on this issue, before I invite the panelists to share their presentations, I wanted to talk a little bit about why we're here today. And the reason is because we are in an era where we are realizing that climate change is not just an environmental issue. Many decisions of critical importance for the global climate and for an effective transition to a low carbon economy will take place outside the climate policy community and in the fields of energy, security, trade, investment, development cooperation. So we see that there is a need for an integrated climate change foreign policy approach to improve the effectiveness of the current global climate regime. And as such, it would cover actions to mitigate or to adapt to climate change in near and long terms, characterized by international agreement that would see a worldwide participation. And I really see that this global framework of challenges of climate change actually reveals, new opportunities across sectors to align goals through policy areas, through international spaces. For instance, in international diplomacy and relations, these are new opportunities presented for international diplomacy to further our climate change objectives within the European Union, within transatlantic relations, the Arctic or the UN system. Within energy security and investment, we see that these issues are actually coming up to be a top priority at the national and international level. And I think it will remain so as long as international geopolitical uncertainties continue at this trajectory. And as long as emerging powers like China and India continue to grow. In terms of international peace and security, climate change really threatens to undermine the state's ability to ensure security and stability. So climate change still appears quite low on the priority of individual governments, but that's because, partly because that threat feels very abstract, and it is not, the linkages between climate change and security are not as well articulated as I imagine they will be in the next decade. And I think perhaps Ravi ji, given his expertise, can articulate these linkages for us better. And when it comes to to trade and investment, right now we look at three issues: trade investment liberalization, for developing countries to address mitigation and adaptation. And the second, that trade and investment rules can act as aids or they can act as obstacles for climate change efforts. And the third, that these relationships can actually constitute a wider platform for cooperation, which leads to another important issue of development cooperation. Because while there are a number of ways in which development cooperation policy might influence the ability and inclination of developing nations to collaborate on effective climate change efforts, it must be recognized that the leverage of development assistance is marginal, particularly in regard to high emitting developing countries, right? And of course, this is all, no change is really possible unless there's institutional buy-in within the foreign policy community. This is a global problem for which we need to join hands globally to solve. And this requires all foreign ministries across the globe to set the direction and tone within their institutions for pushing this agenda forward. Which is why we are here today to actually discuss more and bring more clarity to the linkages of climate change and foreign policy, climate security, all of these new emerging dynamics, so to speak. So without further ado, I would like to invite our very first panelist, Dr. Chandralal Pandey, the program coordinator and community development program at Kathmandu University, to give his presentation. To introduce Dr. Pandey, he is currently an assistant professor at Kathmandu University, and he has over 15 years of working experience in South Asia, particularly in India and Nepal. Dr. Pandey has an extensive working experience in the fields of public policy, focusing in the areas of political economy and environmental affairs and disaster governance. And he earned his PhD and postdoc in Science and Public Policy from the University of Waikato in New Zealand. Oh, welcome, Dr. Pandey. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Chair, for your nice introduction. And thank you very much for organizing also for giving me an opportunity to present. Let me begin now. How much time do I have, Chair?
$10 minutes.
Okay, all right. Let me begin, because the title of this, let's say, panel is Climate Change and Emerging Dynamics in Nepal's Foreign Policy. So my presentation connects with climate change debate and Nepal's foreign policy, particularly climate diplomacy of Nepal. And I'll be talking about, the impacts of climate change, on Nepal, and then I'll also discuss briefly about what is happening in global negotiation about climate change, and what types of, let's say, climate change negotiating blocks are there in global negotiation, and what is the existing climate diplomacy of Nepal, and what is the status of, let's say, nationally determined contributions in terms of changing, let's say, 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius limit of global warming or climate change in the world. And I'll touch upon, finally, what can be the enhanced smart climate diplomacy for Nepal in terms of carrying out its foreign policy related to environment and climate change. I have only 10 minutes time. I may go up to 10 to 15 minutes time, but I will keep myself very brief as well. And if you have any questions, definitely we'll have a follow-up discussion. So if you look at climate change in Nepal, Nepal has been party to climate change negotiation since 1992, right? Ever since we have convention on climate change, and then Kyoto Protocol, Copenhagen, Paris Agreement, and let's say COP26 of Glasgow. So Nepal has always been party, and Nepal has been, let's say, working towards achieving the goal of UNFCCC, let's say, in one way. But then if you look at our contribution, if you look at our contribution, then our contribution is very small. We don't contribute quite a lot of, let's say, greenhouse gases, but then the brunt that we get, they are very high in terms of impacts, right? There are lots of impacts, and these impacts are related with sustainable development goals that Nepal is planning to achieve, particularly in terms of agriculture. You can see the impact of climate change on agriculture, on our water system, on our health system, on our economy, and then our livelihood, right? When it's connected with agriculture, health, water, economy, then obviously it is connected with livelihood. So climate change is impacted now, and it will impact more in the future on our livelihood or our path of living itself. And because of climate change, we are encountering lots of different types of, let's say, disasters in Nepal now, which affect, our vision of developing, let's say, resilient communities, right? We want to build our communities resilient, climate, let's say, climate proof kind of, let's say, communities. But our rural communities, our urban communities, they are also facing new types of challenges, right, due to climate change. And we have these kinds of impacts, right? And then climate change has been a very serious issue for Nepal now and in the future also, because we are the one who are getting badly affected due to climate change. And what is happening in terms of, let's say, global negotiation, right? If you look at global negotiation, recently we had this, let's say, the Glasgow Pact, right? And before that, we had one important, let's say, agreement, which is called Paris Agreement. And if you look at these documents play around 1.5 degree to 2 degrees Celsius, let's say, global warming, right? Global temperature rise. Particularly, you can see most of these documents, they accept that, well, we may not be able to limit ourselves, by 1.5 degrees Celsius, and we may go to 2 degrees Celsius. Okay, that's what we see. And if the world goes up to 2 degrees Celsius, countries like Nepal, they have, greater implications, negative implications. Similarly, another important thing of global negotiation is who is going to burden the soldier of addressing climate change, right? That is another important thing, which is connected with North-South politics also, right? Most of developing countries and least developed countries, they argue that, well, it was, let's say, a byproduct of advanced countries' development. Therefore, advanced countries need to take responsibility. But advanced countries, they have their own argument that they are developing now. For example, as emerging economies are rising, they also need to shoulder the burden of addressing climate change. So these kinds of, let's say, important concerns are there. And if you look at, climate change issues, states are participating in UN system and states are discussing, whereas the issue itself is connected with people, day-to-day activities of people, people's livelihood, people's economy, right? People's living, how they live, what kind of, culture, what kind of, let's say, economic system they practice, right? What kind of future they want to live in. It's connected with people, but if you look at our structure of, the global negotiation, it's primarily state-centric. And, there are 197 plus countries, and there are concerns with these procedural issues also, because when anything needs to be decided, mostly it is believed, it's written that consensus must be achieved, right? And then it's very difficult to achieve consensus from 197 plus countries, right? Therefore, these are some, major issues of negotiations which we see, and they affect our target. For example, island countries or small countries, they argue that, well, we might get inundated soon, right? For example, Maldives. Maldives always prefers for 1.5 degrees Celsius or even lesser than that. Nepal does the same. But other countries like Russia, countries like Saudi Arabia, United States of America, China, India, may disagree on these kinds of issues. And they may say, well, we can go up to 2 degrees Celsius. So you can see those kinds of things also. That's another important thing we need to know. And if you look at this global negotiation, as I said, that 197 plus countries, you can see different types of blocks also. For example, you can see umbrella group. They believe that 2 degrees Celsius is okay, which is led by United States of America, New Zealand, Australia, these countries. And you can see European Union, they are in between 1.5 degrees Celsius to 2 degrees Celsius. And you can see, another one, EIG, Environmental Integrity Group, which is led by South Korea, actually. They also say that, well, 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius is okay, fine. And then you can see LDC, least developed countries, they get, stuck to 1.5 degrees Celsius. You can see G77, right, which is inclusive of China. There also you can see, Nepal is a party of G77 also. And Nepal is party of LDC, right? But LDC argues for 1.5 degrees Celsius, and G77, seems fine with 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, right? And there are new manifestations after let's say, Copenhagen Agreement or during Copenhagen Agreement, let's say, like China, India, and United States group, or basic countries, BRICS countries, these kinds of new emerging, let's say, blocks, negotiating blocks are also appearing. So in this situation, right, let's say it's very complex for Nepal to handle its climate change diplomacy in relation to foreign policy, let's say. So what is, let's talk briefly about what is existing Nepal's climate diplomacy. If you look at Nepal's diplomacy, as I just now said, for example, Nepal is connected with G77, Nepal is connected with LDC. Nepal, when it becomes party of LDC, 1.5 degrees Celsius, when it goes to G77, 1.5 to 2 degrees, okay. So Nepal's position itself is mixed there, right? Because you can feel that in G77, there is diversity, there is heterogeneity, not homogeneous. Homogeneity is not there, but heterogeneity is there. Countries like China, countries like India, right? They are there. Countries like Brazil, South Africa, countries like Maldives, Nepal, and Bhutan, they are also there. So there is heterogeneity, right? If you compare their economic standing, military standing, right? Their power, soft power, hard power, whatever, they cannot be compared, right? So those things are there. And then, when those things are there, then Nepal staying there agrees that, well, 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius is okay, right? That's what Nepal's voice is, right? But then if you look at the commitment, NDC commitments made by all the countries of the world, which have already submitted, then if all the pledges are met, the world is going to encounter 2.4 degrees Celsius, temperature warming, right? In let's say, current NDC's commitment. But then if the world follows current policy that they are practicing, then you can see that 2.9 to 3.9 degrees Celsius temperature rise. So there is some kind of problem for Nepal, you can see that. And Nepal believes that, well, whatever kind of NDCs Nepal has submitted in 2016, it can maintain, let's say, global temperature below 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, but realistically, it is not. And Nepal is still unclear about certain issues, for example, common but differentiated responsibility. In the past year, let's say 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when advanced countries were there and other countries, they were just struggling at the time, we had this north-south politics, very, very important. We had rich countries and poor countries, let's say, divided, very important. But today, you don't see, that rich countries are only emitting. You can see that emerging economies are also emitting quite a lot. So where do or how do these emerging economies play a role? I think that is fundamentally important. Equity issue is equally important, and then burden sharing issue is equally important. But Nepal still follows, this north-south politics of past, and it has not been able to articulate clearly what needs to be done in future negotiation.
Dr. Pandey, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap it up in the next minute. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chair. I don't think I will be able to stop, wrap in next minute. It's too short time. If you invite for presentation, at least you need to give 15 minutes time, Chair. Keep patience. When somebody talks, things need to be talked out well. It's not just for, appearing and saying something and bye-bye only. Okay, then I skipped a lot of things. I don't want to talk quite a lot about, how comparison can be made in terms of China, Nepal, India, and other countries. And what is the status currently? If you look at, let's say, climate tracker, you can understand quite well. If you look at, the target of 1.5 degrees, Celsius, you can see that only Gambia's NDC is sufficient. The rest of all countries who have submitted their NDCs, they are not sufficient in terms of achieving 1.5 degree, let's say, a target. And what Nepal can do as a smart diplomacy in the future, that is, Nepal needs to talk about global negotiation. Nepal needs to go global, but Nepal needs to focus on place matter type of responses also, right? If you talk about adaptation and mitigation, adaptation issues in India, adaptation issues in China, adaptation issues in US, and adaptation issues in Nepal can be different. Nepal needs to focus on its own adaptation issues locally. And another is, when Nepal goes to global negotiation or any other negotiation at that time, Nepal needs to carry out evidence-based, right? Evidence-based facts, which can be presented in front of, let's say, global communities. And then, global communities can be made, very much responsive, sensitive, ethically, and morally. So demonstrate domino effects on human socio-natural ecosystems, right, which we are getting affected in Nepal, and including loss and damages. So evidence is very, very important, and evidence must be taken together. And Nepal needs to emphasize on investment designed on short-term, medium-term, and long-term actions to address climate change. At the same time, climate change-induced other disasters to build resilient communities. And Nepal needs to emphasize on low-carbon development, funding, know-how, and technology. But at the same time, to carry out important foreign policy, Nepal needs to build dedicated team for climate diplomacy and negotiations, right? Nepal needs to avoid climate tourists, which often go to different types of, let's say, international conferences and they come back as tourists. That needs to stop. And Nepal must focus on moral and ethics beyond current debates of CBDR, historical responsibility, etc. And then, try to stop free riders. And one of the most important things Nepal needs to do is prioritize multilateralism, which is UNFCCC forum. And at the same time, trilateralism, engage with China and India, bilateralism, engage with India, engage with China, and engage, embassies which are in US, in China, in India, because these three countries collectively, they emit almost 50% of carbon dioxide in the world, right? But at the same time, if you look at the Glasgow Pact, Nepal has some very good opportunities also, right? Because Glasgow Pact talks about phasing down of coal. That means there's a lot of opportunity for Nepal to engage in producing renewable energy, right? So Nepal has that capacity. Nepal has over 6,000 river and rivulets, right? So Nepal can engage in, Nepal can provide leadership for hydro renewable energy, let's say. If those things are maintained, Nepal can, I think, carry out very good climate diplomacy in the future. Lots of things to discuss, but because of time, Chair has already indicated to me, I stop here. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Pandey. I think we'll just move on to the next speech or presentation. And perhaps in the end, we can tie it all and open for questions if we have any and if we have time. So on to the next speaker, I'd like to invite Shilshila Acharya. She is the co-founder and director of Avni Center for Sustainability, which is a nonprofit, and Avni Ventures, a recycling business based in Nepal. Shilshila led the No Thanks, I Carry My Own Bag campaign you may have recognized in Patpatini or Labi Mall or these other commercial spaces, which has been very successful in bringing policy to ban plastic bags in Nepal. She has been recognized as a promising young social entrepreneur by the Global Good Fund, and she was awarded the Conservation Awards 2018 by WWF Nepal for her work on fighting plastic pollution. She received the prestigious KOS Award from the Nepal Army for her contribution towards the mountain cleanup campaign 2021 that cleaned 6 mountains of Nepal during the height of the COVID crisis. So Shilshila, let's hear from you.
Thank you so much, Sajal, for that wonderful introduction. And I would like to really thank the organizers for inviting me on this important discussion that marries the issues of foreign diplomacy and Nepal's foreign relations with climate issues. So normally when we talk, whenever we talk about climate and environment, we only talk more of it as an environmental issue or more of a scientific issue, but this kind of discussions are very important. And why do we need to talk about it? Because climate issues are not just an issue of science, right? In the end, what is causing all of this problem, and why are we as humanity, though knowing all the problems and knowing all the solutions, not being able to solve this at a global level? Because ultimately it's an issue of political willpower, and that is not happening. That's why it is a political issue, and it must be discussed at political forums, and it should be tied up with other things. And also climate change is a transboundary issue. So that means that all of the effects that we are seeing from climate change, they do not just affect one country, but they affect across countries. The natural disasters and environmental issues do not respect national boundaries. They happen across national boundaries, and even the effects like climate-induced migration, which we're already seeing in the form of climate refugees. Those are also, transboundary issues. And, climate-induced refugees, disasters, and the conflicts related to water and natural resources, all of these can put significant strain on and become a cause of conflict between countries. That's why it's so important to talk about these issues in context of foreign policy. And also when we talk about solutions, again, the impacts are felt across boundaries. So the action also has to happen across countries. That's why it's so important to talk about here. So in my speech today, I'm not going to talk too much about the jargons because a lot of us know about the technicalities of things, and also it might get too boring. So I'm just going to touch upon that in a nutshell, and then also talk about specific examples. So when we talk about foreign policy, in the first place, what is foreign policy? It is about having our voice, our identity established in others in front of others, and how we state our priorities and our how we secure our national interests, and based on our relationship with other countries, right? So for us to be able to state clearly to other countries what we want from them, how can our relationship be? We have to be really clear what is our vision for ourselves, right? What is our identity? What is our vision? What is the direction that we are going? We have to have our plan, our vision clear. And then only based on that vision, what we want for ourselves, we can ask and we can collaborate with others on how we can work together, how they can help us, and how we can also protect our national interests and meet our objectives, right? And here, starting from this basic premise itself, I see a lot of issues because time and again, I'm saying this based on the kind of speeches that are being given by our representatives in different national forums, international forums, as well as the experience of teaching and discussing these issues with hundreds of politicians over the past 1.5 years. So what I have realized is that what is our vision for ourselves is that we are a very poor country. We don't have much resources. We are very much affected by climate change, which is true. But then, we are a country who are waiting for money and waiting for technology from others, and we don't have any self-agency. We don't have, any resources to start working on these issues on our own. So that is the vision that we have for ourselves. We are LDC. We place so much of importance on being a LDC chair or LDC country that, it really frustrates me. We are so hell-bent on painting ourselves as a very poor and helpless country. That is our vision for ourselves. And that's how we also portray that when we talk with others, So again, who are our messengers? Our president, like how well respected our messengers are, who are bringing this message to the world. So our president, when she wrote during COVID to different countries to help us in COVID response and all, we didn't get a good response. So we know how much of respect or how much of standing we have through our messengers. Also, our last prime minister, when he was in a visit in China, he was asked about climate change and he answered about acid rain. So that's the level of understanding. And current prime minister, he talked about leadership that Nepal could take. He talked about net zero emissions. He talked about emergency. So sounded a bit better, but still, within the political structure, political system, like I see very little understanding of the science. I see very little understanding of the urgency. And it is mostly, though externally we have, portrayed different things, like whenever we go out in the international forums, and again, all the international efforts I see are guided by others' events, others' deadlines, and what we need to, go there and say so that we can get resources. It's like a, going with a begging ball. I see it like that. Like in our first nationally determined contributions, we said we would go 20% electric vehicles by 2020. But then within the country, electric vehicle customs was raised. And even those people who were about to transition to electric vehicle were forced to buy petrol vehicles. And we talked about 40% forest cover, but then we also advanced Nisgard forest as one of the very priority projects. And government was very, proud of cutting all those trees. So, we see these conflicting things that we're doing. And also in international forums, we talk about, net zero by 2045, 45% forest cover by 2030 and all. But in reality, like here, we also talk about petroleum extraction for ourselves, right? And in second NDC, we talked about making waste management more inclusive. And but in reality, the government's focus is to bring big companies in Nepal and to consolidate the waste management and bring FDI, and then replace the existing players that are already doing a lot for waste management, and bring letting foreign companies come and handle the waste, but they did not think about how the existing ecosystem of waste workers would be handled. So I see a lot of misalignment in what we are saying out to the world and what we are doing internally inside our country, right? And also inside our country, like that's what we say to the world. But internally, I've seen that the mindset of most of the politicians is that, oh, this is a problem created by foreigners. We didn't have any role in that. So if they give money, we will do something. But then, as such, we don't have much responsibility. Oh, we don't have the resources. So why should we do? So there's I don't see any accountability, and also like internally, shamelessly, we are promoting policies like we will export sand and export aggregates and stones to reduce the trade deficit. So what are we saying outside and what are we doing inside? That does not align at all. And on the one hand, Ministry of Environment issues a policy to ban plastic bags, and on the other hand, Ministry of Industry keeps issuing license for new plastic industries. And also we say that private sector is a big part of the solution, but then during the consultations during COP26 also, I was part of a lot of negotiations where the sense is that when private sector says, okay, we need this policies for you to change so that we can operate more effectively, then in those negotiations the focus is only on, okay, forget about the policies, what are you doing, give us the videos, give us the examples so that we can show it to the world. It's like that. It's not like helping the private sector so that we can do better internally and talk about it internationally, but it's more like we need to show it internationally, that's why we need something from you. So there are a lot of things like that. And also we had in the last I believe it was last like budget speech, we increased like infrastructure tax 5 rupees, but we should have had the vision to call it a carbon tax. If it was a carbon tax of 5 rupees, we would have been seen as a leader in international arena also, and saying that, okay, we have increased this tax in petrol and diesel, this kind of fossil fuels, so we are introducing a carbon tax. We have already introduced a carbon tax, but because we didn't say that, we called it infrastructure tax. So now whenever there is a price hike in petroleum related products, all the political parties, especially the youth groups, their first demand is to reduce the price of the petroleum by removing these kind of taxes. So if it was framed in the other way, then we could have had very strong case to bring the youth in favor of us to keep the carbon tax, right? So like all of this is coming from a lack of vision, like what we want for ourselves and how do we show leadership? How is it align our talk internationally and our actions within the nation? So I don't see much alignment in that. And also like for us to be—
Sorry, Shilshila, but can I ask you to wrap up? Thank you.
Sure. I'm just wrapping up. So for us to be going to international forums and asking for different types of help, like it also requires us to show leadership, right? So is our own action being guided by the urgency? Is it guided by the science? Are we utilizing all of our strengths to address it internally? Is there willpower within us? Is there leadership? So those things have to be addressed first before we go and say in front of the world, right? So what should have been? So I talked about what is happening, but what should have been? Because the earlier speaker also talked about China and India. We are between two big emitters and very powerful neighbors. We cannot deny that. We have to live with that. We have to learn how to also help others so that we can get helped, right? So right now, in terms of climate change, the world is looking for solutions. It is looking for cheap and accessible solutions. It is looking for cheap technology. So we should be able to frame our ask in the form of investment so that we can help them, so that we can help them reduce their climate emissions. Just by asking for donations, no one is going to help us. So I believe that as Nepal, as a country who has had sustainability ingrained in our DNA, right? All of our practices, lifestyles for centuries have been, our epitome of sustainable design. So based on that, we can be the country to actually offer the solutions to the world, and that's what we should believe in ourselves first, and that's what we should be projecting ourselves as, and our actions and words should match. That's all for now, and I would like to explain it further in the next session. Thank you.
Thank you, Shilshila, and thank you for shedding some light on the ground framework of conflicting national policies. I would like to now invite Ravi Kumar to talk. Ravi is a
Yes, ma'am.
doctoral research scholar at the Department of Politics and International Relations at Central University of Jharkhand, and I believe you have an expertise in climate change as a threat to the internal security of Nepal. So we are very looking forward to hearing your insights. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Ma'am, I will present in a presentation form. So I am going to share my screen.
Okay, great. Are you able to share your screen, or do we have to make you a host? Or
he can, we have made him the co-host.
Okay.
Please try.
Thank you.
Ma'am, is it visible?
Yep.
Okay.
Well, we can get started.
Thank you, ma'am. So I am going to discuss about the climate change, a threat to the internal security of Nepal, and I will discuss with start to discuss with the climate change. That what is climate change? Why the whole world is jungling about this word, and the whole world is nowadays start accumulating itself in this single issue, and there are so many summits for this issue only. Climate change, what is climate change? Climate change refers to long-term shifts in temperature and weather pattern. These shifts may be natural, but since the 1800s, human activities have been the main driver of climate change, primarily due to burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, which produces heat-trapping gases. According to UNFCCC 1992, climate change means the change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere and which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over comparable time periods. Climate change as a threat. Environmental threats are linked to their overall impact on human survival, well-being, and productivity. In other words, human security, human being, and social relationship become the objects, or preferably subject, that are to be secured from environmental threats. Not state. Environmental changes can have direct and immediate effects of well-being and livelihood. For example, water scarcity. For example, water scarcity may not cause war, but still endanger insecurity by contributing to dehydration-related death, reducing food production, and undermining livelihood opportunities. Environmental threats can also affect a diversity of subjects ranging from individual, families, communities, social organizations, various identity, diaspora, and geographically centered governments and biological species of various kinds. Climatic disasters in Nepal. What are the main climatic disasters that is happening in Nepal in the fewer decades are as following. Climate change not only affects agriculture, livestock, tourism, hydroelectricity, livelihood, and economy. It is supposed to affect almost every sector and people from every walk of the life, either directly or indirectly. Besides direct impact of climate change, there is many other indirect impacts of climate change that might affect Nepal and its people severely. Climate induced disaster and this further consequences can be as the indirect effect of climate. Example, climate disasters in 2014. Some of the examples that is happening in Nepal, like flood. Floods in Nepal are particularly associated with summer monsoon rains and are a feature of current climate variability. The country more than 6,000 river and rivulets with a total of 45,000 kilometers in length support irrigated agriculture and other livelihoods, but wreak havoc in valley and in the Terai region when they overflow. Landslides. It is another climatic induced hazard which are often related to extreme rainfall or flood events. Landslides also have significant impacts on communities and infrastructure. Nepal is a country of uneven terrain and people of hills and mountainous region are considered to be vulnerable to landslides. Drought. Due to climate change, some part of country might get excessive amount of rain while other part might suffer from drought. Increasing temperature might trigger drought event. Climate dynamics suggest that agriculture in Nepal will face immense challenge as seasonal drought increases. The impact of the 2008 and 2009 winter drought on farming and on local food security was severe. In that period, most monitoring stations received less than 50% of normal rainfall. 30% records no precipitation at all and temperature were 1 to 2 degrees Celsius above average. Forest fire. An increase in the frequency and intensity of droughts, if coupled with extended forest cover, will greatly increase the risk of forest fires. These fires not only had a negative impact locally, but have other indirect long-term impacts too. The loss of forests implies loss of local livelihoods. It may also affect integrity of local water sources. Biodiversity also will be severely impacted by forest fire and changing climate. Impacts of climate change on Nepal. Impacts on agriculture. The agriculture sector accounts for around 3/4 of employment and around 1/3 of gross domestic product in Nepal. The sector is predominantly made up of small-scale farming, and much of this is dependent upon monsoon and natural rainfall. Agriculture is considered extremely sensitive to climate change. Climate change might reduce the amount of desirable crops, while on the other hand, encourages pests and weed proliferation. Impacts of climate change on livestock and production. There is a growing concern on the effects of climate change on livestock production. Climate change can have positive as well as negative impacts on livestock production. On positive aspects, rise in temperature may result into more greenery and pasture land, benefiting livestock production in high mountains. impacts on hydroelectricity. Water is critical for Nepal's power production, as hydroelectric plants provide around 90% of total electricity. Rainfall has a major influence on electricity generation. During the dry season, river flows are insufficient to operate all plants, which results in high level of plant interruptions. Impacts on livelihood. Climate change impacts will affect Nepal through a number of pathways, including disasters, hydropower, irrigation, and domestic water uses. This might lead to the change in livelihood of people. Some people migrate to other places for better livelihood, while some others might change their habits to adapt to the changing climate. Some people have changed their cropping system or patterns. Impacts on economy. Current climate variability and extreme events led to major economic costs in Nepal. These are dominated by floods, soil erosion, drought. It also includes rainfall variability on agriculture. Low seasonal river flows reduced hydroelectricity generation, which impacts greatly on country's economy. The 2013 study on economic impacts assessment of climate change in key sector has estimated direct cost of current climate variability and extreme events equivalent to 1.5 to 2% of current GDP per year.
Raviji, I'll have to ask you to wrap up in the next minute. All right,
Okay.
last slide.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, ma'am. Conclusion. The beginning of 21st century brought a new hope of new direction for global peace, cooperation, and development. The internal security paradigm should be understood for practical purpose so that friendly relations can be helped to build up a safer environment for mankind, not confined to one nation's state or regional bloc of nations. The smaller states are challenged by several internal and external factors. The external and internal factors like weak diplomacy, aid dependency, environmental concerns, globalization, global rivalry, and cultural diversities, social backwardness, geostrategic location, poverty, environmental degradation, and others. These vulnerabilities and their weakening position today mainly comes from the internal factors, although some external roles can't be denied. Security is, of course, a precondition for sustainable economic, social, and political development. Investment of scarce resources to unproductive activities such as purchase of military equipments has neglected the social and human security. Such tendency creates poverty, unemployment, and other humanitarian problems, which led to the rise of extremism and as a result, violence and instability occur in the form human-centric factors. Therefore, modern security have paid more focus on human-centric factors for sustainable peace and stability in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Raviji, and thank you, Shilshila ji, as well as Dr. Pandey for your insights. I'm afraid we cannot get into question and answers because we do not have the time, and I don't want to take more than what we were allocated. Regardless, I would like to conclude by saying that this is certainly a great beginning for more conversation on climate change being beyond just an environmental issue. And because many decisions of critical importance for the global climate, for an effective transition to a low carbon economy will take place outside the climate policy community, in the fields of energy, security, trade, investment, development, cooperation, it is really great and really timely that we are having this conversation right now. Thank you for hosting the space to NICE and Dr. Pramod Jaiswal. I will now hand over the floor to Sumnima or Dr. Pramod to take us to the next session. And thank you again, Shilshila ji, Dr. Pandey, as well as Ravi ji for your time, and for the rest of the participants in making this such a great session.